The highway was a white vein under Jackson Ryder's tires, a narrow light between banks of snow that rose like the sides of some cold cathedral. The truck's heater rattled in a small, steady way he had come to lean on like a metronome. Headlights snagged on drifting flakes and threw them forward in a slow, relentless fall. He drove without music, because silence felt safer when the world around him was trying to freeze him into memory. 3 years folded into the silence since Daniel had not come home. 3 years of routines that began to smell of paint and coffee and the way the empty studio door looked in late afternoon light. Jackson had learned to measure days by the way grief's weight shifted, a heavy slab at dawn, a thinner ache by dusk. Tonight, the ache had the same particular raw edge. Christmas Eve pressed at the edges of everything, as if the town itself remembered who had once loved its nights. Then, the headlights caught something else, an outline on the shoulder, small and hunched, black against white. A figure with a coat too thin for weather like this, a hat pulled low. The hazard lights of an old sedan blinked ahead, abandoned, and for a second, Jackson thought of a fawn frozen on the road. Instinct changed his speed into something sharper. He pulled over before he could picture the person gone. Snow hissed under his boots as he moved up the bank. The young man, young by the droop of his shoulders and the thinness of his legs, was sitting on the guardrail with his hands cupped around his face, trying to catch warmth where there was none. His breath came in quick little clouds, and when he looked up, the color drained from his face to a chalk that the cold made permanent. "Hey," Jackson said, softer than he meant to. His voice sounded enormous in the white hush. He crouched without asking, the way he had a dozen times when he'd been deputy and someone had needed help at the side of a road. "You okay? You can get in. Truck's warm." The young man blinked. His eyes were too big for his face, a pale blue that looked at once frightened and exhausted. "I'm Finn," he said. The name came out like it had been held underwater and finally broke the surface. Finn Holloway. Jackson's mouth tightened. Holloway. The name had a heaviness in the county, one of those names that carried stories. He thought of Robert Holloway then, burly, quick-tempered, and always a man whose word had felt like law in certain bars and back rooms. The surname set a cold new possibility in Jackson's chest, but he pushed it aside. There were lives, he reminded himself. There were people in the open, and people thrown away by them. "You'll freeze," Jackson said. "Jump in." Finn's fingers were purple by the time he closed the truck door. He kept his hat low, and for a long time he did not meet Jackson's eyes. The heat inside was immediate and soft. Finn hugged his arms around himself and after a minute let out a breath that might have been a laugh or a small sob. "You can't be out here?" Jackson said. "What happened to your car?" "No idea." Finn's voice had a brittle quality. "He said he was taking me home. My dad, he said he'd be right back. Didn't come back." "Your dad?" The words settled between them like a bruise. "Are you hurt?" "No," Finn said. Then, faster, as if speaking slower might let something worse in, "I'm 21. I'm fine. He left." Jackson took the number from the call display and dialed the sheriff. Sheriff Miller's voice came through warm and immediate. Miller knew Jackson, which was shorthand for trust, for fewer questions, for things handled before they aggravated. They would take Finn to the station, Miller said. Someone from the county shelter would be called. Jackson agreed, then watched Finn's hands, small, ink-stained, twitch as snow melted on the truck's warm window. When Miller arrived with a pair of state cruisers, Finn still refused to sit in the car that awaited him. He refused the blanket Miller offered at first, then accepted it after a minute, as if he had to think permission through. The sheriff's deputy worked with a practiced gentleness born of years of bodies and stories. Jackson felt relief at the sight of someone else's steadiness. All the while, Finn's fingers kept going to a small canvas tube strapped inside his canvas bag, the way a man keeps his own rib cage protected. In the station, paperwork moved the way it always did, slow and exact, and Finn handed over a little battered sketchbook. In it, lines and colors hinted at a hand that had an ear for texture and a bravery for color. A sketch of a barn in a wash of red and gold took Jackson back to afternoons watching Daniel paint. There was a familiar stamp to the way the light bent in the strokes. The smell of oil paint on Finn's jacket, faint, turpentine and linseed, made Jackson's throat close. "You an artist?" Jackson asked when the deputy stepped away. Finn nodded, and then his eyes darted up, affronted for a moment, and then softened. "Studying. Trying." "You got a place to stay?" "No." A minute's pause. "My dad owns the Holloway place. He doesn't want me to be here. He said—" Finn stopped. His hands tightened on the blanket. Later, after phone calls and a shelter phone number left on a piece of scrap paper, Finn looked at Jackson, folded like a bird with too many broken places. "Can I stay tonight? Just until the shelter says something?" Jackson thought of the empty rooms in his farmhouse, the way Daniel's paintbrushes had stood on their own in the studio, the way the fridge still had the faint curl of Daniel's magnets. He thought of the cold and how faster people got ruined out here, how small neglect could calcify into a night that seized a life. "Yeah," he said, the word a decision more than he intended. "Stay. There's a blanket with your name on it somewhere." The farmhouse smelled like clean wool and coffee, and a faint, guaranteed residue of Daniel's existence. An easel in the corner, a palette hardening like a map of another life. Finn sat at the kitchen table with his hands pressed to a steaming mug Jackson had made without asking how he liked it. His fingers left prints on the wood that were small, raw, human. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to," Jackson said, moving through the quiet as if he could rearrange it. "We'll call the shelter first thing." Finn watched him for a long time. The way he looked at Jackson was not only grateful, it was tentative appraisal. He had the look of someone who had learned to read men for weather. "It's my dad," Finn said finally. "Robert Holloway." Jackson's mouth went dry. He had met Holloway more than once in his years as a deputy. Once a barked command in a bar, once an argument over property lines, once the kind of glare that suggested a man used to getting what he wanted. There were, in this county, people whose names bent the law's edges. Jackson felt, for the first time since he had pulled Finn from the road, a steadier pulse of watchfulness. "You said Holloway left?" Jackson asked. "He dropped me off and said God had called him," Finn said. "Said I needed to repent. Said he was doing the right thing." Jackson's throat moved. "Did you ask anyone to call you a—" "No," Finn said. "I didn't. I didn't want him to hear." The shelter had space, but only for families and only after a long intake. Social services wanted to know if Finn had evidence he had been left, photographs, witnesses. Finn had a bruise on his arm where a belt strap had left a faint mark. He said it had been from falling while they were packing, an unconvincing story that wrapped around itself. County policy defaulted to safety. Finn was an adult, but an adult who had been placed into danger by someone entrusted with him. The lawyer they sent, soft-spoken, efficient, said there could be a case for reckless endangerment or abandonment if evidence could show intent. What no one in the office that smelled of lemon and institutional carpet suspected was more private and more corrosive. Jackson, years before, had seen Robert Holloway in a doorway with a man he'd loved. It wasn't an image Jackson had sought. It was a recollection he had folded into his belt like a blunt stone. He had been at the old mill years before, a town fundraiser where locals carried things in for silent auction. Daniel had been there, a crouched smile, hair brushed back, carrying a small canvas. Jackson had run into someone by the back door, a heavy-set man with a softness behind his hard-set eyes. It had been Robert Holloway. The two had stood close, speaking in a low voice, and Jackson had watched as they put their heads together. When he had cleared his throat, they had parted awkwardly like men who had been caught naked by familiarity. Daniel's hand had been on Robert's arm, and for a fraction of a second their fingers had twined with a tenderness that made something in Jackson crack open. He'd never asked Daniel about it. Grief later shut him down. The image lived as a small, hot secret he kept from himself and, shamefully, used as a fuel for anger when Holloway's name came up. He tried to forget that juvenile, intimate cruelty, to know, and therefore to resent, but it went with the rest of the collage of the man he had lost. Now the name was Finn's surname, and there were reasons why the memory pried at his eyelids like frost. Something else threatened to be revealed. The quiet had a crack in it, and someone was about to take a stone and pry. Finn slept on the couch that first night, blanketed and shivering into the curve of himself. He woke sometimes with a start, and Jackson would find him on the porch, breath fogging in the cold, whispering words into the dark, as if they might stitch him together. Jackson would sit with him in the porch swing and hum a few bars of something old and hold space. It was work. It had nothing to do with heroism. It was two people learning how to build a room where warmth lived. The days that followed blended into routines that were small and tender. Finn scrubbed the kitchen tiles one day until his forearms ached, and Jackson laughed at him and told him to stop. Finn took that chiding like a hand given back. He worked the barn and learned how to mend fences, his fingers blistering at first and then becoming calloused in a way that pleased him. He began to paint again in the studio, brushing over a canvas that Daniel had left half-finished, an image of light falling through barn slats. Finn's hand moved with a reckless, hungry commitment. Jackson would watch him from the doorway, the smell of turpentine cutting all the way to the place memory had been scarred. Sheriff Miller came by twice in the week to check on things. He watched the way Jackson looked at Finn and said nothing, but when they spoke in the driveway after a round of feed, Miller's face grew tight and businesslike. "You know the Holloways," Miller said. "Used to hear his name," Jackson replied. Miller's jaw tightened. "Robert's no saint. The county's been looking at some of his trucks, moving things at night. We don't have the proof, but people talk." "That him?" Jackson asked. Miller hesitated. "He's got influence. Just be careful. People like him don't like to be overlooked." The day a county deputy called to say Holloway's truck had been spotted on the highway the night Finn vanished, everything sped into brittle motion. A neighbor reportedly saw a man in a truck drop off a young person wrapped in a blanket, then drive away. There was, on the footage from an intersection camera, a car pulling to the shoulder and a figure dropping out of it. The county was small. Footage blurred the edges but sharpened intent. The lawyer advised pressing for charges. Holloway's response when he was located at an outbuilding near his home was the furious script of sanctimony. He had done what was right, he said, left Finn to pray and repent. He yelled about protecting the town's morals with that particular brand of righteous fury that tried to tie public virtue to private violence. Then something else came to light. Someone at the diner, an older woman who did alterations for the Holloways and kept a thoughtless photograph that had fallen out from under a stack of old receipts, handed Sheriff Miller a small sepia-toned Polaroid in which a younger Robert Holloway stood with a different man, arms close, eyes shy. The man with Robert was unmistakably Daniel. Hairline, the cheekbone slope, the paint smudged along his knuckles. The diner woman had found it under the receipt for a wedding cake, or maybe a donation to the mill benefit, and she had kept it because it looked like a sweet thing that had no place being at the bottom of her work drawer. The photo traveled the county like a rare bird. For some, it was confirmation of rumor. For Finn, it was a key, turning in a lock that had stuck for years. In the photo, Daniel's eyes were the same as in Jackson's memory, laughing, open. There was no betrayal in the picture. There was a tenderness that made things that had been sharp and jagged appear suddenly plain and human. When Jackson found out, he felt like he had been pushed into floodwater. The image sickened him, not only because it was a private thing now made public, but because it connected threads he could not deny. Robert's loudness about morality was not purity. It was an attempt to bury his own intimacies by burning whatever threatened to show them. Hypocrisy, when wielded as a weapon, could be brutal. "You think Robert and Daniel?" Finn began, his voice barely adhering to the phrase. He had found the photograph while cleaning out an old trunk of Daniel's things, the way young people find relics of the dead and imagine lives where they might have fit. "You don't have to make this your burden alone," Jackson said. But the words wavered. He had the impulse to say nothing and to yet say everything. In the small hours, in the warm, lit cocoon of the farmhouse, Jackson told Finn what he had seen years before at the mill, how Daniel's hand had rested on Robert's arm, and about the way knowledge had set heavy inside him and curdled into a hard thing he'd nursed with anger. Finn listened without flinching, and in that listening, something among them changed. They were not just two wounded people. They were two people who had histories that intersected in a way that felt like fate or like cruelty. The county lawyer moved forward with charges. Robert Holloway was arrested on account of reckless endangerment. The charges were narrow but real, leaving an adult in hazardous conditions when the man had clear reason to believe the person would be endangered. The more serious charges, assault, detention, hinged on different testimony and private matters. The photograph became, in the public's mind, both evidence and a scandal. The accusers, who had been silent for years, found courage in the idea that the man who had been a bully for too long might finally be accountable in a way that mattered. Robert's defense strategy was the old one: indignation, threats, and a flurry of public piety. He told anyone who would listen he had done nothing wrong, that his son had simply left home, and that he had entrusted the boy to the Lord. His voice at the counter sounded less like a father asking for understanding and more like a man used to getting whatever he asked for. People in the market crossed the street. The Holloway farm looked suddenly lonelier than it had in years. The harder work, however, was not in courtrooms and filings. It was in small rooms where trust rebuilds itself like a careful mason stacking stone. Finn had nightmares for months, images of being left in the snow replayed in his sleep. Jackson learned to walk him back from those nightmares with tea and slow breathing and the patient repetition of the fact that he had not been abandoned who mattered anymore. Finn began to open in spurts, talking about his art classes, about how his father had insisted on bettering him, how homophobic words had been thrown like pebbles until his confidence had cracked. He told Jackson about the first time he had felt seen in his own skin, a teacher who had smiled at his painting and said, with no other agenda, that he had a gift. "You've got a good eye," Jackson said. "You put light down in a way that holds the rest together." Finn's jaw flexed. "I've been afraid to touch anything I loved since, well, my dad taught me to hide it, even from myself." Jackson watched him paint. Finn's hand moved with an urgency that was part hunger and part confession. The studio, Daniel's studio, became a sanctuary that smelled like linseed and remembered conversations. Jackson tended the edges of it. He cleaned brushes and cut canvases and, with Finn, began to repaint things that had been left half done. Finn's palette seemed to want warmth, ochres and reds and the fierce gold of afternoon. He painted a barn light as if it were a hearth. Their intimacy took its own time. There were small invasions first, a hand placed at the small of a back when Finn stumbled down the steps, a shoulder held in a way that said, "I am here." Conversation grew from practicalities to confessions. Jackson told Finn about Daniel in a way that was not boastful but honest, about the way he had laughed with his mouth wide open, how he had made terrible coffee, how he used to leave notes in pockets like small time capsules. Finn told stories of his own that made Jackson laugh in a way that felt like fingers plucking at a harp string he had not thought still had music. "You've got a good eye," Jackson said. "You put light down in a way that holds the rest together." Finn's jaw flexed. "I've been afraid to touch anything I loved since, well, my dad taught me to hide it, even from myself." Jackson watched him paint. Finn's hand moved with an urgency that was part hunger and part confession. The studio, Daniel's studio, became a sanctuary that smelled like linseed and remembered conversations. Jackson tended the edges of it. He cleaned brushes and cut canvases and, with Finn, began to repaint things that had been left half done. Finn's palette seemed to want warmth, ochres and reds, and the fierce gold of afternoon. He painted a barn light as if it were a hearth. Their intimacy took its own time. There were small invasions first, a hand placed at the small of a back when Finn stumbled down the steps, a shoulder held in a way that said, "I am here." conversation grew from practicalities to confessions. Jackson told Finn about Daniel in a way that was not boastful but honest, about the way he had laughed with his mouth wide open, how he made terrible coffee, how he used to leave notes in pockets like small time capsules. Finn told stories of his own that made Jackson laugh in a way that felt like fingers plucking at a harp string he had not thought still had music. One night, months after the snow, they found themselves in the barn after a storm had stripped the world of edges. Finn stood in the doorway, the dark behind him like a gulf, and Jackson watched him framed by a rectangle of cold. The loft smelled of hay and the slow, sweet rot of things that keep animals. Finn had been working on a canvas and had left a line of paint on his thumb. He held out his hand without asking. "Come in," Jackson said. "Sit." He sat close on the bale of hay. The moment had the delicate tension of a hinge waiting to be turned. Finn looked smaller than the barn, the way art sometimes does to a person, both heightening and shrinking them down. Jackson's hands were not young hands, but they had scars and the steady knowledge of work. He reached and brushed the paint from Finn's knuckle with his thumb. The touch was a small, deliberate kindness. Finn's breath hitched. "You don't have to be careful around me," Jackson said. "I'm tired of making the world into something to be afraid of." Finn's gaze fell to Jackson's hands, then to his face. For a second, there was a frailty like glass. Then Finn leaned in and kissed him, slow, a question, pressed forward as if it feared rejection. The contact was both arrival and permission. Jackson answered with a gentle kind of hunger that matched Finn's own. The kiss was careful, tender, like men who were not saving themselves, but choosing to be given to one another anyway. Consent, when it happens in the repair of two broken things, is threaded through with lightness and caution. They did not race or perform. They learned and learned again. Afterwards, they sat with their foreheads together and let the barn make a noise around them, the creak of wood, a distant drip. They did not speak of forever in the way boys in movies do. They spoke of a next step, of the possibility of a home that was not haunted by weather. The court proceedings were ugly and slow, the way truth sometimes is when it stumbles through the law's orderly corridors. Robert Holloway raged in a way that was at once performative and terrifying. He tried to cast himself as the aggrieved parent. He baited witnesses and tried to weaponize piety. But the photograph and the community witness that had seen him leave Finn at the roadside proved difficult to dismiss. The county's attorney played the footage on a small screen in the room. The image was grainy and the moment brief, but the jury's faces were plain maps of attention. In the gallery, Finn sat stiff as a wire, and Jackson's hand found his knee under the bench. They did not speak. Sometimes, touching a hand is a speech long enough to change weather. When Jackson was called to the stand, he felt himself become a narrow instrument of memory. He said what happened, the facts. He described the smell of paint in the truck, the way Finn had the line of an artist even in his posture. He could not say everything he wanted, the hurt that sat in his chest, the how much later of watching people choose their brands of cruelty. But he said what the court needed. He had offered sanctuary, Holloway had left Finn in dangerous conditions, the county had cause to prosecute. Finn's testimony, when it came, was quieter than anyone expected. He told the story without melodrama, the way someone who had practiced surviving told it. The arrival, the words his father had thrown like stones, the feeling of being set outside. His voice did not shake when he said the man's last words, "You need to be fixed," but there was a thin acoustical ache beneath the syllables. The jury saw a young man who had been dismissed and left to a night that could have ended differently. When the verdict arrived, it was a small justice. The law ticked its box. Robert Holloway was found culpable for reckless endangerment and fined, ordered to complete community service and attend counseling, with a restraining order placed regarding his son. It was not the dismantling of the man's power. It did, however, break something like impunity. The local paper ran photographs and, in the next week's issue, a column about small towns and the dangers of carved reputations. Holloway's name lost a little of its stratation. But the real work remained, beyond verdicts and fines, the mending of confidence, the slow accretion of domestic trust. Finn took classes, community college night art classes, and a week of therapy with a counselor who specialized in trauma and in the restitching of lives. He sold a small painting at a local market and only afterward realized how that sale vibrated in him like validation. He taught a child in the county how to make a watercolor wash, and the child's delighted face unfurled something inside him like green shoots under snow. Jackson and Finn's relationship deepened, not through dramatic confessions, but through the quietness of shared chores. Jackson taught Finn how to check the oil in a tractor and how to roast root vegetables without burning them. Finn showed Jackson how to mix colors to get a certain bruised purple and how to be exact with a brush. They learned the grammar of living together, how to split work, how to apologize, how to say, "I'm sorry," without waiting for triumph. 6 months later, the farmhouse was different in a way that made people notice. There were new curtains Finn had designed and Jackson had sewed. There were fresh flowers in a mason jar in the kitchen, the first time Finn brought home a bouquet from a corner of a field he said he had found. Daniel's studio had become something of a shared shrine and an active workspace. Finn had repainted the half-finished barn scene into a portrait of the two of them, standing at the barn door, hands almost touching. The painting was not flamboyant romanticism. It was the solidity of two figures rooted in the same small light place. Jackson, seeing it one late afternoon with the window light already autumn stiff, felt something close to peace pool in him. Word in town softened. The diner woman, who had given the photograph to the sheriff, brought over a loaf of bread for Finn and said nothing about rumors. Sheriff Miller came by once and leaned on the fence and told stories that had nothing to do with tragedy. A neighbor who had once crossed the street to avoid Jackson now waved. The community did not reverse all its small cruelties overnight, but things tilted. There were still moments when Finn flinched. An unexplained shout in the street, a glance down at a phone, and a memory of being left. Jackson learned to watch for those things and to hold space for them. They attended counseling sessions together when it was clear that each was carrying their own load of old loneliness that tugged at the seams. They found ways to ritualize safety, a key under a pot out back, a code word when Finn needed a pause, a system for phone calls when one of them traveled for a gallery showing. The town's Christmas came again, and it was quieter, more deliberate. Finn painted a small portrait of Jackson for the mantel, a careful study of hands. He painted the lines around Jackson's eyes like commas of kindness. On the eve of the holiday, they walked the length of the property and hung lights on the farmhouse eaves. The winter, which had once blown at Finn like a threat, now simply moved them as wind moves trees. It was a thing to respond to. On a December morning, as pale sun carved the fields in straight edges, Finn finished a portrait of the three most important things that had turned his world: the barn, the studio, and a small painting inset of Daniel's smiling face. He set it in the window to dry, and Jackson came to stand behind him. Finn's fingers were smudged with color. "You kept me," Finn said, the word spare. "You kept me," Jackson answered back. It was, in a small way, true in both directions. Each had rescued the other in the ways they needed rescuing. The photograph that had exposed the Holloway secret sat in a drawer on the sheriff's office, an artifact of a past that had been unmasked. The town no longer quite talked about Robert the way it used to. People's eyes were watchful in different ways. Robert himself kept mostly to the Holloway property, a cautionary, public shadow. He had, in the end, held a relationship he could not reconcile to the face he presented. That contradiction had cost him something: respect, power, the ease of public performance. It had not, and could not, undo the damage he had inflicted, but the town's response had shifted in a way that let Finn breathe. Spring edged in, which meant long hours in the studio and the barn. A small show at the county center featured Finn's paintings, the barn lit by golds, the farmhouse a portrait of Jackson's hands. People came, and Finn's work sold modestly, enough for him to feel seen. He did not need adoration. He needed, and received, acknowledgement. At the reception, he stood beside Jackson, and someone in the crowd raised a glass and said simply, "Two new families." In that moment, the house felt full. They did not have dramatic proclamations of forever. They had instead a collection of small agreeings about kindness, about what to do when fear came back, about how to be accountable and to love. On the porch in early evening, with a blanket over their knees and the farm spread out in a slow blue, Jackson laid a hand over Finn's. "I don't know what the future wants of us," he said. Finn looked up at him, and the barn behind them caught the last light and accepted it. "I don't either," he said, then smiled. "But I like that you're in my present." Jackson laughed, low and genuine, and Finn leaned his head against his shoulder. When Finn later painted the portrait that would hang over the fireplace, an image of two men standing at a barn door with light between them, he signed it simply R and J, but the initials were small and modest. The portrait became, in town, a quiet testament. Two people who had been found, who had built a home out of weather and policy and the fragile alchemy of care. Robert Holloway lived on in the background, his story a cautionary whisper. He was not the villain of a cheap play. He was a man who had used religion and power to justify cruelty, who had hidden his truth until his secrecy and projection tore his family apart. The revelation that someone had seen him with Daniel years before, seen them together in a photograph that served as both proof and indictment, changed some minds and opened some wounds. It did not heal everything, but it shifted the town's compass enough for people to begin asking what their obligations to each other truly were. And that, more than verdicts, more than newspaper ink, was the work that mattered. Jackson and Finn, together, tended it day by day, mending fences, painting, going to counseling, taking standard legal steps to ensure Finn's safety when contact was necessary. Theirs was a life rebuilt piece by piece, a kind of architecture of ordinary kindness. One evening, as late summer eased into a softer heat, Finn uncovered an old tin box in Daniel's studio. Inside were postcards, dried flowers, a Polaroid. He looked at the Polaroid and then at Jackson, who had been nearby mending a strap on a saddle. Finn's eyes were reflective. "You kept seeing the pieces too?" he asked. Jackson came to him and took the picture. He did not say what he felt, how complicated and raw it still was, but he slid the photograph into a frame and set it on a shelf beside a line of small, useful things Daniel had once used. It was no altar to pain. It was a recognition that truth had a strange way of arriving, sometimes salvageable, sometimes almost too late. They stood then, two men with histories they had not chosen, and they fit together like hands cupped to shelter a small flame. It was enough to warm them for now. Outside, the world turned, sometimes unjust, sometimes kind. Inside, in the studio, where light pooled like gold, Finn painted another portrait. The image showed two men, standing with their backs to a barn, hands not quite touching, but close enough for a breath. He painted the light so it looked like forgiveness, and paint and sunlight braided together. When Jackson saw it, his throat made a small, steady sound. "You're better at capturing light than I am," he said. Finn smiled, tilt of his head, paint on his jaw. "You taught me to look." They stood in a quiet room, a house humming with small living things, and for once they let the moment be simple. Two people who had been seen, who had been rescued, who had made a life where apology met the work of rebuilding. The photograph in the frame was a reminder that sometimes those who preach purity are the ones who need the most scrutiny. The portrait on the wall was a promise they had made to one another. And beneath both, the world was warm enough to grow new things. The snow had melted long ago, and the cold had turned into a season they could relate to rather than fear. Finn held Jackson's hand as the sun moved across the barn. And for the first time in a long while, Jackson let himself imagine a future that would bear their names, together.